Welcome to our next edition of the International Talks in Lviv, a place where we have conversations with great minds about Ukraine and the world, especially in this tough time. And we welcome in our studio Professor David Ellery, who has been in his career as a strategic issues and exercises director for the UK's Royal College of Defence Studies, member of the Chief of the Defence Staff Strategy Forum, co-director of the UK-US Rising Leaders Forum, and also advisor to different governments on security issues. But today, Professor Ellery will speak in a personal capacity. So, why did you come? Why are you in Ukraine?
What is going on in Ukraine at the moment is, I would say, goes without saying, is not just of bilateral and regional significance. What's going on has a global strategic significance. I think it's very clear that Russia has moved on. I used to describe Russia as a strategic Mephistopheles, drawing on a reference in Goethe's Faust to Mephistopheles being the spirit which always negates, also der Geist, der stets verneint. But it's more than that. It's more than a frustration. And I think we've seen a fundamentally disturbing shift towards aggressive imperialism. And I think the history of the world is very clear about the imperative to counter an attitude of aggressive imperialism. So I would see what Ukraine is doing today with great resolution and resilience. And I was here in May, very briefly, as a guest of Otstav Krivdik, to get a first feel for what was going on. And what came through loud and clear was the resolution and resilience of Ukraine in the face of this aggression. And I'm pleased to see that there has been widespread support for this position from around the world. As somebody coming from the UK, I'm delighted to think we're going to have continuity of attitude and policy with respect to Ukraine. Our newly appointed Prime Minister has made it very clear he will be in Kyiv very shortly. Our Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, who has a military background, is staying in post. And I think that's a very important signal, both internally to the UK, but particularly to the people of Ukraine and beyond to Russia. So I'm back here now. One of the reasons is because in mid-January of next year, I'm going to be directing an international symposium dealing with Ukraine. I'm delighted to say that His Excellency Vadim Pristaiko, the Ukraine's ambassador to London, with whom I had dinner last week in London, together with our Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Radukin, he will be a key participant in that symposium. Jan Piekla, whom you're going to interview in a few minutes' time, an outstanding expert, former Polish ambassador to Kyiv, but a real expert in terms of Ukrainian and Russian affairs, will also be there, and it will be quite an international cast.
What is the aim?
The aim of that is not so much looking back. It's taking into account what is happening or what will be happening in mid-January, but critically, it will be looking forward. And when Ukraine comes through this and is the victor in this war, what does Ukraine look like? What might it look like in that post-conflict phase? What kind of thinking, ambition and aspirations might there be, both internally, political and social structures, but also in terms of international engagement? There's a analogous to this is the discussion and the strategic debate which went on in the UK in 1942, when Churchill recognize what we describe as the turn of the tide in the war, which was no coincidence that the US was committing significantly to that war, which was the product of very, very detailed personal engagement between Churchill and President Roosevelt. But he recognized that the tide had turned. And he set about stimulating very deep, detailed consideration of what the UK might look like when we had won. And so working through the hard issues and what the options in relation to them might be. And having had some terrific discussions yesterday, really encouraged to hear already there are those of leading status within Ukraine who are already turning their minds to this. And I really think it's important to have that parallel track of prosecuting as effectively as you can a military campaign to win the war, but in parallel to be working through what those strategic policy issues are once that conflict has been brought to a conclusion.
So your point is that we have to spend as much energy on the issue of development and further development, post-conflict development, post-war recovery, as to the war issues.
There was always going to be a balance and priority. In the first instance, you have to win the war. So there may be some tension there. But you're absolutely right. In parallel, there has to be significant effort. So whether I say absolutely the same, but very significant, detailed effort, rigorous effort in the thinking and working through and the identification and evaluation of those strategic options that must take place in parallel.
You learn a lot, you research a lot on leadership, and in terms of that, what do you think, what can you advise to the leadership that has to be in Ukraine, not only in terms of military?
Yeah, great.
Stuff.
It's a crucial question, that. Thank you. No, really, thank you very much for that. Not being patronizing when I say that. That really is important. I think strategic leadership is characterized, individuals or a group. It can be a leadership, which is made up of several individuals, is having a very clear vision of the strategic direction of travel. So it wouldn't necessarily be just one very fixed, concrete objective. And I think the times have passed with that. I'm actually the author, co-author of a piece called Adaptive Strategy, which has informed the UK Integrated Review last year, which promotes a much more flexible, elastic approach to this. The leadership comes where that vision is articulated in a clear, compelling narrative. And that narrative to be promulgated through a variety of channels. And that's, I think, the opportunity, but the challenge of today is it's not just one or two channels through which you can communicate, but it is having a national conversation. It is not just top down. The leadership is there to say, we are in receipt of information and understanding, albeit imperfect, incomplete. But on the basis of our understanding, we have arrived at the following conclusions. We now want to engage in debate and discussion at a national level to determine what would work for Ukraine and Ukraine's population.
What do you see as an effective mechanism for that? Because during all these 8 months after full-scale invasion of Russia, we feel a very strong vertical, so from top down, and many experts say that it's right in the times of war. So in military aspects, it's right. But what do you say about building the state, the country is a bit different, and how do we manage to have to have it in synergy.
That's very good. It's absolutely right. And in terms of, if I just think back to the UK experience in the Second World War, and having a Chief of Staff's Committee, which was chaired by Field Marshal, he was then General, Alan Brooke. Churchill never ever overruled his senior military commanders on a topic of military importance. There was a delegated authority, but he was very, very clear that as Prime Minister, he was accountable to Parliament in a liberal democracy and through Parliament to the people. And every week, Churchill would make a statement to Parliament and through Parliament to the people on the state of the war. And I think it's a leadership having confidence, if you like, in their own ability to be able to convey messages which might not always be easy ones to convey, both in terms of the nature and extent. They might be very difficult questions. We have similar questions being asked at the moment in the UK in terms of our economy. Difficult questions, you hear that all the time. But it's identifying those channels of communication, and dare I say, I'm sitting here today in this studio, this is one channel of communicating to a particular audience. There will be other audiences. There will be members of Ukraine's population which might, unfortunately, not tune in to this broadcast channel, but they will be looking to other sources of information. And it's up to that leadership to determine what the operative channels of communication and engagement are.
If we're talking about communication and different channels of communication, in terms of your experience, how strong do you see a threat of disinformation and propaganda, and how it is shifting? Where do you see it shifting, and how do we cope with that effectively?
It's very, very tricky, isn't it? There was, it genuinely, I wish I had a nice, neat answer to that. I don't think there is one. I mean, there was some research a couple of years or so ago, 3-4 years ago, I think it was MIT, which was able to establish that fake news spread 6 times faster than the truth. And that's very, very difficult to counter. What you can do, and this is timing, and this is where you're looking to influence the strategic context, the space in which you're going to be engaging with a population. So it is time and timing, and being very, very clear as to what the message or set of messages is you want to convey, and get those messages out there. I think what was been striking, there are 2 very, very striking characteristics of what's gone on and is going on in Ukraine at the moment. The first is, I think that trade, finance and economics have not just been weaponized, they've actually now become a domain of warfare. And I think that's a very, very interesting shift. The other is the extent to which the West, if I can use that term loosely, made use of intelligence a number of months ago to shape a context of understanding for people. Actually, having been in receipt of information which very, very unequivocally pointed to a particular set of maneuvers by Russia, and actually putting that out into the open space. And it pulled the rug from under Russia's feet, because there was no surprise then. Absolutely no surprise. And so it was out there, it was compelling. And I think the narrative that strategic leaders have to convey, it's not just clarity and being compelling of itself. It has to be fashioned and delivered in such a way as to generate trust and confidence. And that combination, that axis of trust and confidence is fundamental to authority. And in a democracy, that authority from an electorate, from a population, is crucial. A very good example of that is the conversation that was had in Finland in December and early January of this year. I was in Helsinki in May and had very top-level talks. I can't say any more than that, but I was in top-level talks. And when I talked about the 24th of February, I was very clear at the level I was engaging. They said we didn't need to wait till the 24th of February. We knew there had been a shift on the 21st of December when Putin made his speech, which basically said we're not sure we're going to recognise the boundaries, particularly in the Baltic area, which had been laid down following the breakup of the Soviet Union. The strategic tectonic plates, as it was described to me, had shifted. And within a matter of hours, there was a shift in Finland's attitude towards Russia. A phrase that was used to me was the nature of the beast had finally become very, very apparent. There was then a national conversation within Finland, and whereas before that date, some 35% of Finns, only 35% were in favour of application for NATO membership, within 4 weeks, that had been turned around to very nearly 75% in favour. And that was based on a very rigorous, open, national conversation. A fine demonstration, I would suggest, of both strategic leadership and strategic communication. And it was the product of that conversation was consent on the part of the Finnish population, and then flowing from that permission to a government to pursue a radically different strategic security policy.
Who should be the key stakeholders in such a national conversation in Ukraine from your perspective?
It has to be top. It really does have to go across the top echelon of government. There has to be a coherence and consistency in approach and in articulation of what those imperatives are. But it must be honest, and it has also to be, there may well be some negative aspects to this, but we must face up to them. And there are, in our view, these are the options for best meeting those challenges. But it isn't one person. It has to be that collective. A collective effort, as I say, one which is coherent, but also consistent.
At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned a few times about resilience of Ukraine and Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Can you explain more what you see by resilience, by Ukrainian resilience, and where do you see the biggest strengths?
The biggest
strengths.
I think it's what comes to us in the UK, and as I say, this is only my second visit. It was a short visit in May. I hope to be coming back reasonably regularly. It's a very, very strong sense, I suppose, of a Ukrainian population saying, we are going through a really tough time in so many ways. People are dying, people are being really seriously injured. When I came in May, I saw the most horrific images of children having been horribly injured by Russian missiles, and a very, very extensive child trauma within Ukrainian society. But it has not broken the spirit of Ukraine, and we see some of those images. We see in our own media, and we hear on the TV, online, and in the radio, interviews with people who've gone through the most appalling experiences. But it's very clear to us that the spirit has not been broken. And if I may say so, Zelensky is doing a terrific job, I can honestly tell you, abroad, in being consistent and robust, and stands as an exemplar of what this resistance and resilience actually is. And it's what you're demonstrating, I think, is this is not just a military issue, it's not just a political issue or a philosophical issue, it's all of those things. It's actually a moral issue. And that goes to the heart of the matter. And I think we do recognise that Ukraine sees that. It is existential for you. I mean, this is not just about Russia. I think occupying geography, occupying territory, it goes way more than that. And I think we recognise that. And that's why there is a moral imperative, not just to resist what Russia is trying to, or what is doing and trying to do, but actually to overcome it.
I will not ask you about when we will win, when the victory comes. But I would ask you when you mentioned also in our conversation about the new prime minister.
Yeah.
And that he will come.
Yeah.
So when do you think he will come here?
I think it'll be very soon. I mean, I don't know his schedule. I don't know the detailed schedule. I think you will find it's very, very, very soon. And I think it is a demonstration of that continuity of attitude. There is, and this is, individual nations. It's very, very important that we can have a collective position. Why? Because that position can act as an effect multiplier. So you can have individual nations, individual players who can bring to and have traction. In terms of an alliance and coalition, there is a multiplying effect. But we must recognise that an individual state, but an individual can have a really important role to play. And I think the Prime Minister has recognised that. It was a very, very important decision of his to keep Ben Wallace in his post as Secretary of State for Defence, because he has been quite resolute. He's been very, very clear as to what the UK ought to be doing. And dare I say it, I'd like to think that consistency and that robust approach by the UK would act as a lighthouse to other nations on the continent.
Thank you very much for this great conversation, Professor Ellery, and thank you for support, both your individual support for Ukraine and to the UK's support to our victory and further development. And hope to see you again in Lviv.
You certainly shall, and thank you very much. I enjoyed that very much indeed.